Julie Gelfand is Canada's Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, and she is with me now. Welcome. It's good to see you again. Let's start with your broad criticism of the federal government's efforts to fight climate change. You called it disturbing today. What do you mean?
Well, successive governments, this isn't just this government, it's been all governments for the last 10, 15, 20 years we haven't reached any of our targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And throughout the time that I've been commissioner, I've been doing audits on issues like clean technology, adaptation, getting municipalities ready, investments in infrastructure to make sure everything's ready for a changing climate. We're really not ready to adapt to the changing climate. This is one of the biggest issues that's facing humanity, and we need to reduce our emissions and we need to get ready to adapt. And so that's the part that, as I leave the position, I want to make sure that everybody stays focused on the work that we all need to do.
Right. So, in the last couple of days, here's what we know. We've had an established pan-Canadian climate plan from this government. More carbon taxes came into effect yesterday for 4 provinces across the country. What more needs to happen? Is what you've seen, and presumably not, is that a legitimate climate plan? Is that doing what's necessary? The battle in this country is over carbon taxes right now, and it seems to be less about protecting the climate and more about how much it's going to cost out of your wallet. Are we focused on the wrong thing?
Listen, we have to reduce emissions, and we have a couple of mechanisms. We have several mechanisms to do that. You can regulate, you can participate in cap and trade, or you can put a price on pollution the way this government has decided to do. The real point is we have to reduce our emissions. That report that was issued yesterday by Environment Canada said that Canada was warming at twice the global rate, our north even more. We are feeling those effects. Some of those effects now are irreversible. We are going to have more forest fires. We're going to have rising sea levels. We have to get ready. We have to do what's important to reduce our emissions and to get ready to deal with the changes that we're going to see in the environment.
Why do you think the message is being ignored?
I can't answer that question. The big question is, what are we leaving for our future generations? You and I talked about our children. What are we leaving for our kids and our grandkids? Is it going to be a planet that will be habitable? What are the changes that are going to happen in Canada? Are people going to have to move? Are we going to have ghost towns? Like, what is actually going to happen with our country? That's what we have to try to deal with by reducing our emissions and getting ready to adapt.
Is this, in your view, is this purely a political will issue? Is this just nobody's prepared to push that ball down the field as far as it needs to go? Or?
I think it's hard for humans to think that far in advance. So we are trying to do more. This government has that pan-Canadian framework, which we will audit in the future. The future commissioner will continue to audit that work. And I have spent my time here making sure every year we audited something related to climate change. But it's tough. It's stuff that you're talking about for your grandkids or even your kids 20 years from now. We don't see the immediateness, even though it is happening immediately for some people. Many of us don't see that. And so it becomes hard to deal with an issue that's kind of out there which you're not particularly feeling.
Okay. Speaking of political will, let's talk about your audit of what are described as those inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. The Liberals promised to eliminate them by 2025 since they undermine efforts to deal with climate change. What did you find?
So we looked at how well the government was trying to achieve that goal of reducing inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. What did we find? We found that their definition of inefficient was so broad to be pretty much not useful to guide their efforts.
Pretty much not useful is useless, isn't
Pretty
it?
close, yeah. I encourage everybody to read their definition. I don't call it a definition. I don't know who would call it a definition. Series of broad considerations, not a definition. The second thing that we found that was disturbing was that Environment Canada was looking for non-tax subsidies. These are hard to find, and they're throughout the government, all kinds of, and their inventory, they looked at 23 out of 200 possible departments. So I'm not confident that they came up with the proper inventory to first find out what are all the subsidies and then figure out what are inefficient subsidies. And they're looking at only 23 departments, missing grants and contributions, missing research projects. It wasn't a complete inventory, and so I'm just uncomfortable with that. They need to do a better job. They have launched some public consultations, so Canadians can participate in that. That's a good thing.
Right, but so why is it important to know this? Why is it important for the government to know what's on offer, what's not on offer, what it has, how it defines it? Why is that important?
Well, the government says it clearly that having inefficient fossil fuel subsidies in the system makes it difficult to deal with our climate change problems and reduce greenhouse gases. So
what do we mean by that? What do we mean by an inefficient fossil fuel subsidy? Do we even know what that is?
Well, they haven't defined inefficient. A fossil fuel subsidy would be some kind of grant or contribution to lower the price for the production of fossil fuels or the consumption of fossil fuels.
Right.
Either way, those would be what you would generally define as a subsidy. The question of inefficient, that's the government's job to define it. Right now, the definition that they have, I would say, is not a valid definition.
Does the government consider that purchasing a pipeline is an inefficient fuel subsidy, fossil fuel subsidy?
They didn't even consider it a fossil fuel subsidy. Whether or not it was inefficient or not, it wasn't even in the inventory of potential fossil fuel subsidies, which is an example for us of, there was a subsidy to help increase the production of fossil fuels. There was another subsidy that was given for oil sands companies to clean up their waste. These are all subsidies and grants to fossil fuel companies, and they weren't considered in the whole inventory that they produce. So to me, the inventory was lacking.
Okay, so there's this disagreement over how to define what it is they're dealing with. And as I understand it, the government rejected your recommendations on this, on how to determine this definition. Is that what they rejected? Have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen them reject a recommendation from an environment commissioner? I've
never had it. I believe it has happened in the Office of the Auditor General, but in my 5 years, I have never had a department disagree with me.
What does that say?
Well, they disagreed with two parts, with the bit about the inefficient and the definition. They also disagreed that our expectation that social, economic and environmental considerations be given equal weight. They disagreed with that. Now, when you think about the definition of sustainable development, particularly in the new Act, the Federal Sustainable Development Act, it is quite clear that when you think about sustainability and sustainable development, you're supposed to have all the information on all three parts of that stool, economic, social, and environmental, before you take a decision. That's where they disagreed.
Okay. Let's talk about, you also recommended improvements to the monitoring of mining waste. Why?
So what we recommended was, our big issue with the mining chapter, the chapter on, or the report on mining, was we were quite concerned that non-metal mines that are not allowed to put any substance that could be deleterious or harmful to fish and fish habitat, they're not allowed to release any of that in their effluent. And we found that those mines were inspected less frequently than the metal mines that are allowed to put certain levels of substances in their effluent. And so we were like, these ones are allowed to put basically zero, and they're receiving fewer inspections in a 5-year period than the ones that are allowed to release. So that was our biggest concern with that chapter. We had some other concerns. For example, when they found environmental effects of mining effluents, they used that information to strengthen the limits, to reduce the limits. Right. So that's a good thing. But if they found effects, there was no requirement to solve the problem. So we thought that was a bit strange and recommended that they look into that issue. And also the environmental effects were not publicly available by mine site. So if you lived in a community near a mine, you didn't actually know what the effluents were for your mine site to know what was going into the water system. Right. So we recommended that they make that information public.
A couple of quick things to finish. You also looked at invasive species in the fisheries. What are your concerns?
Well, there I'm concerned about a lot. I mean, Canada is completely at risk. The Fisheries and Oceans Canada don't know which species put us at risk. They don't know which ones to monitor, which ones to regulate. They don't know which ones have been established and where. Here we're talking about zebra mussels. Right. Many people have cottages, can't walk anymore on your beach because of the zebra mussels. There's Asian carp. We're spending a lot of money to make sure that doesn't come into the Great Lakes. But there are other species, and they couldn't tell us which ones were the greatest risk to Canada. And so from my perspective, it puts us at risk.
All right, let's finish on this. These are your last audits as commissioners. 5 years in the job. 5 years in the job, but you've decided not to pursue renewing that. How do you think it's gone those 5 years? How seriously do you think the government has taken your advice? Have you been able to make a difference?
Listen, this government, and I'm talking about all parties, I found that when we went to committee, all the parties were actually very nonpartisan. They actually looked at the data in our reports. They asked good questions on all sides of the House. The Conservatives, the Green, the NDP, the Liberals, they were all asking questions about the impact. And from my perspective, about the results. From my perspective, that's good because they're looking at the data and they're not sort of fighting with one of...
Trying to find political advantage,
in fact, we didn't see that at all. We saw them looking at the data saying, how can we do better? So from my perspective, and from what I'm hearing from parliamentarians as I leave, is that they really did appreciate the work that we do.
Well, I've always appreciated having a chance to talk to you about your reports. Julie Gelfand, good to see you again. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you very much.